Hi there, in this video I'm going to share with you 3 tips, 3 ways that you can use to make sure that your sound effects sound cohesive within your video game project. So I actually had a comment left on one of my videos by Mike, and he was asking my take on what I do to make sure that if I'm creating sound assets for a game, let's say a sci-fi weapon, let's say, what do I do? How do I make sure that all the sounds, all the audio for that one weapon actually makes sense together and they're not too disjointed, right? So that's exactly what I'm going to share with you, everything that I've kind of learned and what I do to make sure that my sound effects are more cohesive. All right, before we jump into it though, if you're new here, I have a gift for you. It's my Sound Designer Starter Pack. It's a sound pack that I have with over 900 sound effects that you can use in your personal project as well as your commercial project. So if you're interested in picking that up, check the description. I'll make sure to leave a link down there. All right, with that said, let's get started. All right, so the first thing I do to make sure that my sound effects are cohesive and make sense together actually starts way at the beginning before I even put anything together or design anything. And there's actually 3 parts to what I do. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the recording. And if I'm going to be recording everything from scratch, it's going to be everything from what am I going to be recording and how am I going to be recording it? What microphones am I going to use? What technique am I going to use for recording those sounds? So all these things are going to affect whether a sound actually makes sense together. So you want to be as consistent as possible with the microphone you use, the position, the environment you're in, and the way that you record the sound sources. All right, if you're not going to be actually recording stuff from scratch, that's totally fine. Then we can move on to the next one, which is going to be looking at your sound sources. And for your sound sources, I like to use my bucket system for staying consistent. And what that is presumably, if you're going to be working on a game or creating some sort of sound effect, you have some sort of idea of the sound that you're going to create. So for example, if you're doing a sci-fi weapon gun, you either have some sort of reference video or you maybe have a sheet that outlines the different characteristics of the gun. And once you know that, then what I like to do is plan out the different layers that I might need for that gun. So for example, I might want a laser layer. I might want something like a design impact, maybe a kick for that sub and that punch. Maybe I want a real gun sample, maybe also some mechanical sounds for the shots, and maybe as well the tail. So maybe I have like 5 or 6 different layers that I'm going to use. So now what I'm going to do on my computer is I'm going to create different folders for each of those layers, and those are going to be my buckets. So that once I do start designing, I'm going to put everything in those buckets so that when I'm ready to actually put stuff and design things to picture for that specific weapon, then I can drag and drop stuff from those buckets and remain consistent in my design. So I'm always going to be pulling from those buckets. So every time I design sounds for my sci-fi weapon gun, I'm always going to be choosing the same kind of 5 or 6 layers. They're always going to be in there. They're always going to be in the sound. So I'm going to have that consistency across all my shots. All right, the next thing I'm going to look at is processing. And for this, I'm going to look at, is there any kind of specific effect or plugin I'm going to use for maybe a specific layer or the entire sound in general? Is there going to be something that's going to characterize the sound effect itself? So for example, am I going to put like a flanger maybe on one specific layer? And if I am, I want to make sure that I'm going to be using that specific plugin on each of the layers every time I'm going to be using it. And then I'm going to be using a similar setting for every time that I'm going to be using it, right? So this is what I want to plan out ahead of time, especially if it's going to be something that's going to really characterize the sound of the weapon. All right, and if you want to take the bucket system to another level, what you can do is, let's say again, you have those 5 or 6 buckets that you're going to use for your weapon sounds. Maybe you want to use those same 5 or 6 buckets across all of your different weapon sounds, right? So if you're creating sound effects for multiple different guns in the game, you can use those 5 or 6 buckets for all the guns, except that you probably want to switch out the different characteristics for each gun. So for example, let's say for one gun, the mechanical layers, maybe you have one that's like super heavy metal. Maybe another gun, it's going to be like super light, maybe tinny metal. And then maybe another one's going to be like a plasticky mechanical sound, right? So that way, every gun in the game is still going to be kind of cohesive. It still kind of makes sense because they're all connected between the different buckets that you're going to use. So that's another way that you can use the bucket system to be cohesive across multiple different sound effects and categories. All right, let's move on to the second way that you can create cohesive sound effects, and that is by connecting layers together. All right, so here I am inside of Reaper, and here I was just working on a little redesign, but I want to show you and hopefully make the point of how connecting layers is really powerful for making cohesive sound effects. So here I have a bomb explosion layer, and what I want to do for you is play you through and show you how the sounds are connected here. So let's just have a listen, and then I'll kind of show you how I created these. Right, so this one is like really obvious because I'm using the exact same 4 layers each time. And hopefully you can tell and hear that it's connected, but they're a bit different every time. So here, I changed for the second explosion here, I changed quite a bit. So I changed the pitch and the play rate for each of these sound effects. So each of these layers here, you can see the pitch is adjusted, the play rate is, that one's the same. Pitch is adjusted, play rate is adjusted, right? So for each of these, they're a little bit different. So it's gonna make it sound different, but I'm using the exact same layers. So you still have that connective like tissue between the two sounds. So you can still hear and know that they're connected and they're the same. Now, what's also interesting is that there's actually a third explosion sound down here. And hopefully you can hear that it's still connected. And let's have a listen to it here. All right, so this explosion sound is a little bit further from the player. It's a bit more distant, and I really wanted to bring that out. But what's interesting is actually, again, I used the exact same layers. You don't have to use the exact same layers every time, by the way, but I was doing that here. Maybe you only want to swap out 1 or 2 layers, maybe 3 layers. But here I did all 4. But what I did here instead is I completely removed the second one, and I really brought down this first layer. This is like the transient. And then what I did is I just added a lot of effects on this layer here. So you can see there's a comb filter, there's EQ to cut out a lot of the highs here, right? So, and then even more here, I'm cutting out a lot of the lows. So I'm really processing them a lot, but they're still the same connective tissue. They're still the same layers. So they still feel connected and they still sound connected. So even though they're very different, they still sound connected. So let's just have a listen again. So copying layers over to the same sounds or to different sounds, that's a great way to make sure that your sounds are cohesive and actually make sense together. All right, so far everything we've talked about has been for multiple layered sound effects that have different sound sources and different layers. But what about single source sound effects or sound effects that just have one layer? What about those? So to make sure that single source sound effects sound similar together, what I like to do is just have some really light processing on the different versions of that sound effect. So that can be everything from having a different EQ profile on the different sounds, maybe having some light compression. It could be everything from saturation, distortion, frequency shifting. It just depends. You can pretty much add kind of any effect as long as it's kind of a light effect so that you can still feel the connection with the original, then you'll still have that kind of cohesive feel to the sound. All right, if you like this video and these tips, there's another one I think you would like. It is the sound design process. It's the sound design cycle that I go through whenever I'm starting a project and I'm going to be designing sound effects. So if you want to see that, I'll make sure to link it up in the cards above. All right, but that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching all the way through to the end. And just a reminder to grab that sound pack if you're interested. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.